For this final session of day one of the Future of the American Child, Charlotte, we have come full circle in a day and a half of discussions around systemic barriers, around education for children, around health for children and youth. We've arrived at a discussion of an incredible series of stories produced by AP reporter Bianca Vázquez Toness. Bianca joins us after working in collaboration with her colleagues to produce the Missing Children series for the AP. It is a year-long, was it a year or a year and a half?
I guess as far as the stories, when they were actually published, it was about a year.
Year-long series of stories about the issue of chronic absenteeism for children in American schools. And why I say it's full circle is we spent yesterday talking about systemic barriers. What are the sort of hardwired issues that prevent children and families from having economic stability? We talked this morning about education and what prevents some families from getting access to quality education, how we prepare our youngest children for education. But what fascinated me about this series and the first story that I saw was actually a photograph accompanying one of the stories, and it was of a young person in some sort of shelter or temporary housing attempting to do some homework. He had his books in front of him, and he's trying to prepare, I think, for school. And it just really drove home for me the vulnerability, overall vulnerability of children in general. But when it comes to a parent who's battling some sort of economic issue, job loss, homelessness, how that magnifies a child's sort of lack of safety net, their vulnerability. And so I thought it was important to end this first day with this conversation with Bianca to tell us not only about why the project began, some of the key things that she learned in the project, but to also give us some insights into doing this kind of reporting. Talking to vulnerable children and families isn't easy, but if we are going to shine light on these issues, we have to know how to do it. And so at this point, Bianca, thank you so much for joining the fellowship today.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought before I let you get into your presentation and describing for us how the project unfolded, tell us a little bit about that moment at which something clicked for you and you decided this could be a project. This is something that the AP should pursue.
So when the pandemic started, I was a reporter at the Boston Globe, and I was an education reporter. And I pivoted like everyone did to focus on well, maybe not everyone, but I focused on the pandemic nonstop for a year, and I wrote about kids leaving school, dropping out because they had to work, because online learning didn't work for them, and I followed a lot of kids very closely. And I also, in my own family, had kids who relatives who dropped out of high school that first year. And I stopped covering the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic probably a year later. I wrote about a lot of other things in school. And when I was considering changing jobs to work for the Associated Press, during my job interview, we were talking about what I would do in this new role that would look at the continued impact of the pandemic, which I was really eager to dig back into because I felt like I had sort of lost touch with what had happened to those kids and to those issues over the course of, the year that I hadn't really been writing about it. And my now editor and I would exchange texts and emails, and one of us, she says it was me, I think it was her, said, yeah, we need to find these missing kids, like these kids who just dropped out of school or stopped going to school during the pandemic. And we both committed to that would be a project that we would do if I came on to take the job. And she won me over because she committed to to following through on doing that project. And she followed through. It was amazing. It's a good story. It's a happy story where, a boss tells you you're going to do something and you actually do it.
Go figure, as they
Yes.
say. So at that rate, I'll let you take it over and walk us through this journey.
Thank you very much. So, I referred a lot to missing kids, and now that you've heard the introduction, you understand what I mean by missing kids. I don't mean kids who, are missing from their parents necessarily. A lot of times parents know exactly where these kids are, but schools don't know where they are. As you know, here, I'll move my water bottle. That's probably in your way. As you know, probably from your own reporting, from reading, a lot of these kids during the beginning of the pandemic dropped out of school because they had to work. Online learning didn't work for them. Maybe they were really young and their parents realized that school just was not going to work if they were in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Online learning just was untenable for those kids. Or maybe they had complex needs that also weren't being served by online learning. School districts had some programs, some school districts, to get some of those kids back, but definitely not all school districts. And they kind of died out. And then schools stopped talking about them. They started talking about them as a budget problem, an enrollment problem, not a human problem of kids not getting an education. So that's why we set out to quantify this problem, try to get a sense of how many kids could possibly be missing from school, and help explain why they weren't there. So my data colleagues partnered with Stanford's big local news team, including an educational economist, for a groundbreaking analysis of public, private, and homeschool enrollment, plus population change, to show that an astonishing 230,000 kids were missing from schools in just 21 states. Those are the only states we could get the complete data from. And by missing, we meant that these kids weren't studying in public or private school, or they weren't officially being homeschooled. This data was from 2021 and the 2022 school year. Later, I can show you more recent, or I can at least talk about more recent data. The states with the biggest number of missing kids were California. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not going through I forgot that I'm the one who's supposed to, sorry. I've never done this before. Okay, so as you can see, that 230,000 kids were missing. The yellow represents the homeschooled kids. Blue is private school, yellow homeschool, purple is the change in population. The other limitation of this is we're using the census data, so we're only looking at kids who were school age, so 5 through 18. So kids who were older than 18, who should have been in school, weren't captured by our data. And these were the states with the most missing kids: California, New York, Louisiana, North Carolina, Washington State. So while my data colleagues were badgering these states to release the data, and they were analyzing the data, I went looking for these students and families. So as an education reporter, I'm used to finding students and families. I have some go-to moves like showing up at the school, talking to parents outside of school, talking to kids outside of school, going to where they hang out. But that wasn't an option here because they weren't in school. By definition, these kids were not going to these places. So I was also looking for kids who were under the age of 18. So I spoke to a huge assortment of people who might be able to help me understand who stopped attending school and also maybe lead me to them. I talked to teachers and principals, talked to teachers and principals, attendance specialists, parent advocates. If you haven't gotten to know the parent advocates in your area, they are incredibly helpful resources. They often have their ears to the ground and know what whose child is not going to school, whose child is not reading at grade level, et cetera. Religious leaders, tenant organizations, legal aid attorneys, sped attorneys, after-school programs in low-income housing developments. That has been, I've discovered a number of low-income housing developments around the country who have their own after-school programs or other community services, and the people who work there have been incredible resources over the last year. Juvenile diversion programs, homeless service providers, GED service providers, day labor organizers, unions, foreign governments, homeschooling organizations. I was talking to foreign governments because at one point, the superintendent in LA, where we were focusing a lot of our reporting, told the Education Writers Association that he thought the missing kids could be explained by kids going back to Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala. And that's why they couldn't find them. So I started reporting and trying to find families who had gone back. It didn't really pan out. Now he acknowledges that they did not go. They were in fact in LA. So in doing this, I really had to think a lot over the course of the year about my own biases and how I asked these questions. And the whole setup of this project, the fact that these kids were not in school, had like a bias baked in. Your kids should be in school. And when I asked, if I asked, for instance, I'm looking for kids who are missing from school. I'm going to change that because that kind of trip is scary. Kids, parent, a lot of times these gatekeepers, and these sources are often gatekeepers, it was kind of a non-starter. Oh, I don't think parents are going to want to talk to you about that. No one's going to talk to you about that. And so I found sometimes it was a lot easier if I kept it much more broad and said, well, I'm looking for people who are just really worried about their kids. I'm looking for people who are worried their kids are not doing well. I'm looking for people whose kids are struggling in some way. It's inefficient. It is super inefficient to do it this way, but it helped get to some families in a way that asking directly did not. So the first story we did focused on two main students. One was a young woman in Massachusetts, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who was in 9th grade when schools were shuttered. She was already feeling alienated at school and didn't have strong relationships with adults there. And she felt like the school was ignoring some of the special education accommodations in her IEP. So when remote learning started, she actually liked that better, but still didn't feel any more connected. And so when school went back in person, she was out of there. She didn't go. She eventually got her GED. And I found this young woman through an agency that helped homeless youth in Boston because she was using their GED services. And then I found this young boy named Ezekiel who was in 4th grade in Los Angeles, who was technically still enrolled in school, but hadn't attended class in 5 months. The boy had been shuffled around to a bunch of different schools before the pandemic. Then he didn't attend much school during remote learning because they didn't have good internet. When he returned to in-person school, he was dramatically behind. He was in 4th grade, but he read at a 1st grade level. And he was acting out, and he had impulsive behavior. And the school that he was then transferred to, even though there was like an administrative court order for him to be sort of eased into school with this gentle program, the school didn't follow it. So the mom didn't send him to school because she didn't feel safe sending him there. And meeting Ezekiel and a bunch of other students like him, who I found who were just out of school for 6 months, but still technically enrolled in school, made me realize that there were a lot of other kids who were missing, but we didn't we didn't think of them as missing. Sorry. They were chronically absent, but they were missing too, right? Because we all know that if you miss 10% of the school year, you are more likely not to read on grade level. You're more likely to drop out of school. And we know that school is important for a lot of other things, not just learning to read, but eating. You get food there, you get psychotherapy there, you get health care there, hopefully you get good peer relationships and good relationships with adults. So we knew that this was important and it was something we should cover too. So we teamed up with our friends at Stanford again and found that a quarter of students nationwide missed at least 10% of that 2021-2022 school year. And that meant that 6.5 million additional students became chronically absent that year. It hasn't gotten much better this year, even though people are certainly working on it more, and there's certainly a lot more attention. It doesn't seem to be getting too much better. It was the worst in Alaska and New Mexico, but it went up everywhere that we had data, which was most states, as you can see from this map. And it was worse among Indigenous students, Black and Latino students, and low-income students. So all of the reasons that fueled chronic absenteeism were supercharged by the pandemic, right? You had poverty, transportation problems, chronic illness, family responsibilities. These are all things that were already a problem for a lot of families, but they got worse. But there were also new problems that felt very specific to this cultural moment, this political moment. It was underlined for me when I met this family in Springfield, Massachusetts. This woman, she's from Puerto Rico originally. She speaks Spanish as her main dominant language. The school doesn't have a lot of staff that speak Spanish. You can speak with her. And before the pandemic, she had very warm, friendly feelings about the school. And that changed during the course of remote learning and afterwards. During remote learning, the school, one of her son's teachers took pictures of him during remote learning while he was in his bed doing, checking online, and shared those pictures with other staff. And she found out about it and thought it was very inappropriate and was really turned off and upset. She also noticed that when they went back to school, the vibe at the school was just different. It was more harsh. People were upset about things. And she didn't like her son's placement, his special education placement. She felt like he was getting really harsh punishment. So when he didn't want to go to school, she didn't make him. He was at a school, I forget what the cumulative total was, but months and months over the course of 2 years. She really wanted to homeschool him, but she felt like he would be too isolated. The other thing that happened was that many families no longer felt like, and this is sort of related to her issue too, many families felt like school just wasn't that important anymore. It just wasn't that critical. That, as this source said in LA, he runs an organization that helps with missing kids in LA. That schools told parents during the pandemic, hey, school can happen anywhere during remote learning. It can happen in a forest. It can happen in your bedroom. It can happen, over dinner. You just have to, we're all just going to do this at home right now. And so families got used to that. The other problem was that some families saw what was happening during remote learning, kind of like the mother that I showed you just before this. Maybe they didn't like the quality of the instruction. maybe they didn't like something that was actually said during class, and they decided that it just wasn't the critical piece of their child's life that they may have thought it was before. So the other thing that became very clear, because my focus was the whole country as we were thinking about who was missing, either completely missing, unenrolled, or just chronically absent. Although we were very focused on LA because, as I showed you before, there's huge numbers of missing kids in California. But one of the things that we learned was that this is highly location specific. There are different issues driving this problem in different places. And in California, what we kept hearing by talking to attendance counselors and principals and teachers was that housing and family responsibility, family obligation of students, that students felt was what was keeping kids out of school. So I met this family who really drove that home for me. This mother, Lillian, is a mother of 2. This is her little girl, and she has a son, Denify, whose picture Rachel was talking about a little while ago. That's Denify. This family had lived, they became homeless at the beginning of the pandemic. They lived in a shelter. They lived on Skid Row. I don't know if some of you are from LA. It is shocking that the biggest family housing shelter is on Skid Row. And this mother who had a baby, her little girl was an infant at the time, was sent there. And they managed to live there for 6 months, but they were absolutely traumatized. She says that she was assaulted in the shelter. And I went down there while I was in LA, because I'm not from LA, like this is all new to me. And it was one of the best things I did, because I realized, of course you don't want to live here. You watch children coming out of there with their parents and they look terrified, because they're people, on drugs, like passing out around them, doing totally sort of chaotic things around them. It's a scary scene for little kids and parents. So she did not want to live in a shelter. So her other option was to go and try to live with strangers in tiny, tiny studio apartments. And when I met them, this was not where they were living. This is the place where they went after I met them. They were living in this tiny shared apartment with a woman who did not want them there. And this young man who had failed 9th grade because he was depressed because of where they were living. This is after having basically not attended, I think it was 7th grade that was during remote learning for him, because he was living in a shelter and was too embarrassed to log in. At this point, he was living in in the other place. He was supposed to go to summer school, but he couldn't, because he had to protect their space in this tiny studio. So he did not leave his apartment the entire summer, while his mom went out to work, went out to take the child to go to the park, because the child's just being a child bothered their roommate. And I witnessed some of the animus between the roommate and them, so I could vouch. She really just did not want them there, and you could understand it. There are 3 people, they're loud, there's a 2-year-old, people snore, like just share, one room. Everyone slept in the same room. Everyone did everything in the same room. It's untenable. But that's also how she paid her rent, right? Was to take in people who would help her pay. So my takeaway from this was that, housing. I think this is a bigger problem than just in LA. I think this is a problem to some extent everywhere, and is driving a lot of kids not going to school. So LA was a place that was very much on the radar of anyone thinking about kids not being in school, because the district was talking about it. They were very open about it. The superintendent was going door to door and taking TV cameras with him as he went to encourage kids to go back to school. It was a problem they owned very much. And, but it was a different city where I found some kids who were probably the most vulnerable. So in Atlanta, this is not a place that really was on our radar as far as missing kids are concerned. There wasn't a huge number of missing kids there, as far as our data showed. But when I was there reporting a different story, which is a testament to, to always ask, wherever you go in your reporting, you should always ask for if people know anything about the other story that you're working on. And I found there that even though we're in this moment when chronic absenteeism is to me it's top of mind, and I think to a lot of districts it's top of mind, there are places that are still enacting a lot of policies that make it very hard for kids to go to school. And Atlanta, Georgia is the poster child for this. Their state and district policies are both getting in the way of this little girl going to school. She's 8 years old. She should be in second grade, but she's never stepped inside a school. Her 3 older siblings have essentially not gotten an education since learning went remote in 2020. One of her older brothers has Down syndrome. No school. And this is her mom. So the main reason that they, hold on a second. The reasons why they're not in school come down to paperwork and the everyday obstacles of poverty. This is the black tape that our previous speaker was talking about, the same sort of, what did she call it? Consumer, not being, not an easy place to navigate for consumers. And parents are the consumers here. Atlanta requires at least 8 different documents to sign up your kid for school. That's in addition to just this is our name, this is where we live. That's double what they require in New York and LA, or where my kid goes to school in Massachusetts. The state requires a complicated health form evaluating dental, nutrition, vision, and hearing status. If you've lost Medicaid coverage in Georgia, good luck getting that. And the district asks for proof of residency along with a notarized affidavit to back it up. School principals have full discretion to ask for more proof from renters. So if you're poor, there's a higher burden of proof to prove that you deserve to go to that school. It's actually written into the district's enrollment policy. And schools can keep asking mid-year for proof of residency. So the reason that this has developed, right, is because of the enrollment zones in schools to keep kids from going to schools that are not their neighborhood school or in their enrollment zone. And in Atlanta and in the Atlanta area, these systems have become really complex and really onerous. For instance, for some high schools that are extremely coveted, for example, there seems to be a custom when they feel like it's extremely overcrowded, they will do an audit and decide, okay, if your lease is expired, if your lease doesn't look good, if you don't live in this enrollment zone, you're out of here. And they get kicked out in the middle of the year. Last year, a high school near Atlanta in Fulton County withdrew 400 students after Christmas. So again, like a district might, have the right to enforce their enrollment zones, but why they have to do it like in the middle of the school year when, we're worried about kids going to school, just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So this woman in particular was caught up in this problem because her kids stopped going to school during the pandemic, and then her partner died during the pandemic, and he had all of their important documents. It left her, including her Medicaid cards, her birth certificates for the kids, the Social Security cards for the kids, all of their important documents that they needed to sign up for school. And it also left her penniless and overwhelmed with 4 kids at home. So what was fascinating and really sad about this case was that the school district, would say that they did everything they could to help her. And when I got the communication logs from the school district, it showed that they did call them 18 times since the pandemic started. But most of the calls went to a disconnected phone or a voicemail. They visited them once, and no one was home, and they didn't go back. So the school district didn't seem to put together that their phone didn't work. Like, they didn't have a working phone. And so it wasn't sort of like willful, not wanting to talk. I mean, they were in crisis, and they didn't have a phone. Last I checked, they're still not in school, even though we published the story in December. These stories are about school, but they're also, school is a barometer, right? Like, if you're not going to school, if you're not either showing up every day or you're actually out of school, it's a sign that there are a lot of other things that are probably wrong and going wrong in your life. And I think these stories are actually hidden in plain sight if we are patient enough and know what to look for, and just sort of follow and look for the obstacles that people are facing when they're obviously in crisis.
Let's have a seat up here and have a conversation with the fellows. I would like to start by asking you about an issue that I have grappled with numerous times since 1986, when I started as a journalist. Having these difficult, heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching conversations, meeting people who are in stressful situations, children who, it could break your heart, just sitting across from them and realizing the trajectory of their life and what could be in store for them. What advice do you have for journalists to prepare, protect themselves, avoid burnout? I mean, it's gotta get to you after a while. I've been doing it 3 times as long as you, but tell them, what did you do to prepare yourself for this experience?
It's a good question. I know that people, I think I have been doing this a long time, and I definitely remember when I really felt burnout, it was when I had to do these types of stories and deal with people in crisis on a more breaking news cycle. I felt like there wasn't a lot of time to recover. It's easier now. I don't feel quite as stressed out. So definitely, I think that people who are doing this, if you were covering, like school shootings and stuff like that under breaking news cycles, I would definitely say that you have to absolutely build in time off immediately after those types of experiences. And
But even more, I'm thinking in terms of the impulse to want to try to help them figure it out,
Oh,
try to
yeah.
get resources. Was that a problem for you or a challenge for you?
We wrestled a lot with whether to help them get phones so that we could communicate with them, because there were two cases, in both the cases of the mom in LA and also in Atlanta, phones were a huge problem. And I would have to fly to Atlanta to talk to the mom because she didn't have a phone. But we decided not to do that. But it was hard with the young man in LA, not because he was depressed and he wouldn't communicate with me a lot of times. And I did have a real urge to send him things that might cheer him up. And
I get it.
And try to, because he was locked in an apartment and completely isolated. And I could see that when we were there and we could get him to talk to us outside of the apartment, he was really curious and really smart and really thoughtful. And his coping mechanism was to ask us a lot of questions about us so that he wouldn't have to talk about himself, but it was very charming. And I could tell that he, but yeah, I know it was very hard not to try to, wrap your arms around this kid and send him chocolate and comic books.
We have a question up here. Can we wait for the mic?
Rin Lewis, KREX5 in Colorado. I just kind of wanted to follow up on that. How do you kind of deal with your responsibility of being impartial as a journalist, as well as wanting to help these people, covering people in unfortunate situations? How do you kind of cope with that yourself, as well as kind of deciding what to do in that kind of situation?
It's interesting. When I cover kids and young people, I don't consider myself impartial. I do this because I'm interested in the welfare of kids, and I don't think enough people are advocating for them or protecting them, so I don't have any problem advocating for whatever's best for kids. At the same time, right, we're also interested in this moment and this problem because it's a result of policy decisions that were made that are controversial, right? Closing schools maybe it's becoming less. I don't know that decision or maybe people aren't thinking about it anymore. I don't know, but that was a controversial decision, and I would say to people all the time when I would try to talk to them, look, you were put in an incredibly difficult situation. It was untenable. You as a parent. No matter what you think about whether schools should have been closed or not, that was untenable. That was an impossible situation to raise kids, juggle your job or not job, or and have 4 kids at home and no income and no partner and no car and no driver's license and nothing, right? So it was pretty easy in this case for me to I had no problems writing about the plight of people in this situation, because I think they were in impossible situations.
I guess sort of what I'm asking is where do you draw the line? You were talking about being tempted to get these kids gifts or get them a phone. Where do you kind of draw the line, and how do you decide what is appropriate and what isn't in that kind of situation?
Yeah, we decided that we didn't want to influence the story, right? And I also thought sending him gifts I didn't want him to feel like he had to talk to me because I sent him chocolate.
Can I go ahead?
Oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
I'm Lindsay Leake with Treasure Coast Newspapers in South Florida and fellow Princeton grad. So go Tigers. I have a logistical question. So if I heard you correctly, you said this project took about a year from conception to completion. And I guess I'm wondering, did you know it was going to take that long? Or how do you tackle a really in-depth, long-term project? And how do you stick with it when it gets hard?
Yeah. I think we knew that it would take or that we would have the whole year to do it. And we really didn't know what we were going to find, right? It was pretty open-ended. When we wrote the first story, we knew we had these numbers, and then, like I said, we sort of pivoted, and we're like, oh yeah, chronic absenteeism is also a big problem. We should write about this. And in fact, that story probably had a lot more impact than the story about missing kids, for whatever reason. Probably because it affected more people, and it was an ongoing thing that people could see in schools now. So how do you stick with it? Well, my boss told me that there was no option to not find missing kids. I mean, she told me that. But fortunately, she also gave me time to do it. How do you stick with it? The other great thing, and I think if you can structure your lives this way and your reporting, is that I was doing reporting that was adjacent to it a lot of the time. You know, I was still, my whole year was structured around thinking about the impact of the pandemic, all the different impacts. So while I was reporting on schools that were struggling to help third graders read on time, I met someone who then led me to the missing kids in Atlanta. So if you can, stories beget stories. So if you can do things that are in the same area and keep reporting and keep staying in touch with those same issues during that year, it helps you feel like you're not going astray. You're still in the same area, you're still meeting people, you're still talking to the people who are gonna lead you to the families that are going to make your stories. But yeah, it was incredibly hard, especially when, to try, this was my first time trying to be a national reporter in the US. I've worked abroad and I've had to cover a country I didn't know very well, but it was my first time in the US trying to do that. And so it was really hard to try to come up with contacts in LA all of a sudden. And these are really intimate, delicate issues, and convincing people that you've never met before to trust you and to introduce you to people that they care about is challenging. So again, it was easier sometimes to just say, oh, I'm interested in parents who are concerned.
Alyssa Rosenberg, I'm a columnist at the Washington Post opinion section. We talked a lot about the sort of structural and bureaucratic issues that keep kids from going to school, but you also mentioned the sort of the cultural issues, the idea that school has declined in importance. Have you found places or organizations that have done a good job of reestablishing the importance of school, reestablishing the habit of school going? And have you seen any public education officials or union leaders who have repented of the way that they talked about school during the pandemic? Because I know there was some really striking rhetoric about, the alternative things that kids were supposed to have learned that, it's
they became resilient.
Yes, exactly.
They learned how to cook.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm a columnist, so I get to be an opinionated pain in the ass, but that stuff seemed insane to me at the time and seems more insane to me in retrospect. And I don't know if you've seen any level of introspection about the way that the teaching profession was devalued from within the profession itself.
I haven't, but I also haven't looked for it lately. I probably looked for it a year ago. We wrote a story. A little more than a year ago, we wrote a story about whether people regretted online learning. People who before may have advocated for it. And I definitely didn't find any people in the unions or teacher teaching ranks who said that. But you asked if there are people who are
doing a good job of sort of reestablishing the importance of school or sort of the habit of school going.
I mean, I think a lot of school districts are trying to do that now. I mean, you probably know what attendance works is, right? I mean, there are a lot of school districts that are definitely following their playbook pretty closely. Whether they're doing a good job is another matter. What I have heard, or if you look at the numbers, it does seem like among more high needs kids, the chronic absenteeism is lessening, but among the other kids, it's not. So it seems to suggest that kids with means are still missing school at a greater level. And that's not changing much, which is interesting because, and if I think about people I know, and these are families with means, there seems to be very little hesitation to go on like long vacations and take their kids out of school for long amounts of time. But no, I don't think, I mean, I've heard my school do some talking about, the importance of going to school, but I don't know if that's.
Your kids? How old are they?
My child is 8. Okay. And I only know about it because I attended like a small little, meeting, and a parent said that they were, planning to take their kid to Argentina for a month, and they were like, wait, you can't do that. And so I think that, I don't think schools have, I mean, they're just, schools have never been very good communicators, and this is a really big messaging problem. And they haven't been re-messaging after the pandemic very well about this.
Hi, I'm Lois Collins from the Deseret News, and I'm just wondering how you balance in a story like this the challenge when you realize that maybe you could get a family that trusted you in trouble with authorities in some way. That to me is one of the trickiest things we do.
So we decided with this family that even though she didn't ask for it, the family in Atlanta, we decided to just use her middle name. And she didn't ask for it. She did ask to keep her kids anonymous, but she never asked to be anonymous herself. But we decided because in Georgia, she could go to jail for 30 days, she could be fined, and she could lose her kids. So we decided to keep her, to use her middle name. But we did, in talking to the school, use her name and her kids' names to understand what had happened in the school system, and she knew that was happening and gave us full permission and signed forms, in fact, so that we could get data that was personal about her. But she wasn't too concerned about the school getting, coming after her.
Hi there, Michelle San Miguel with Rhode Island PBS. It struck me when you talked about how important it was how you asked the question, and I'm always thinking about, the biases that we have as reporters, and, there's biases in the stories that you choose to tackle and who you choose to interview. But, I mean, I think it's a safe assumption to say, like, why aren't you in school? But that we should not be assuming that kids should be in school. But isn't that a safe assumption to make? And I'm curious what other assumptions you had going into the story that you had to set aside.
So that is the assumption. So what I realized was that my questions were influencing the answers I was getting, and maybe even their behavior to a certain extent by asking too much, making too big of a deal. The family in LA, for example, I realized that when we met her, there was this sort of, the tension was about whether her child was going to emerge from the apartment and go to summer school. And we were there at the beginning, the first day when he should have gone to summer school. He didn't go. Would he go the next day? Would he go the next day? That was sort of the drama that was playing out. And would he go? Would he go? And so I think that I think that she knew, actually, that he probably wasn't going to go. And she wasn't really forcing him to go. But I think because of the way that I was asking it, is he going to go? She was giving me the answer that she thought I wanted, which was like, I don't know, but hopefully, and we'll see, and like, you know. so I had to, so I think that it was probably not as important to her as she was, as I was, you know, making. I think that she was sort of performing a little bit for me. And then the same thing happened when school was about to start for real. I was kind of convinced, like, maybe this kid's not going to go because things are, you know, I wasn't sure if he was going to, if he was going to be well enough, if he was going to be, if he'd want to go. And so we decided, and this was really hard because he was in LA, I was in Boston, and I was planning to make another trip. And I realized, like, I didn't want to, if I had asked directly, is he going to go back to school? That, first of all, I didn't know if I really get a clear answer or if she knew. And then also, she would ask me things like, well, should he? Like, is this important? Like, to go to the first day, for instance. He ended up not going the first day. And so she asked me, he told me, Bianca, that it doesn't matter if he goes the first day. It's really dumb stuff, and it doesn't matter. Is that true? And I was like, oh God. I don't know. It really depends on the school district, which is true. I mean, there's some where you can get kicked out. Like, if you don't go the first day, you're off the rolls. So I said, I don't know what the consequences are in LA if he doesn't go to school. And we realized that I needed to stop asking her and had to ask her questions that would instead lead her to just sort of tell me what she thought was important. For instance, and that I would go either way, right? Like, I decided that I was gonna go, but I wasn't gonna say, is he gonna go to school or not? Which is what I wanted to say. But instead, I had to say, what are you guys up to? And it was the week that school was supposed to start. What are you up to that week? If I were to come, like, what time should I come? Oh, we're not doing anything. Okay, well, if I came in the afternoon, do you think you'd be there? Yeah, okay. But it was like the time you're supposed to be in school. Right, I mean, which was crazy. It was bananas way to plan things. But I realized that she wasn't, it was influencing her behavior and also what she told me. If I made a bigger deal out of school, because she was pretty, like, she didn't speak English very well. She was not getting emails from the school. I mean, he was telling her what was going on for the stuff that he wanted to tell her, and she was in some contact with the leaders at school. But she hadn't gone to school in the US. Like, she didn't totally understand, like, the importance of all the rituals and the different administrative stuff. And I mean, she's a very smart woman, but he was controlling some of what she knew or what she understood. So I didn't want it. So I realized that by asking the question and being so gung-ho about the importance of school, that I may have just been, she was a pleaser, and I felt like she was trying to please me by saying, yeah.
Let's come up front here and then to
Andrea Gallo from the Times-Pic. Your reporting is so intimate and so deep and so good. I'm wondering if you can just go a little deeper into your reporting process, particularly with that Los Angeles story. Like, were you just sitting in the apartment all day watching what was happening, or like, how did you get those kind of intimate scenes?
Initially when we showed up, Denify wasn't coming out of the apartment, the young man, and only his mom was coming out of the apartment. So we spent a lot of time with her and her child, because they were living with, you know, a roommate who didn't want them around and didn't want, I mean, you know, wouldn't want a stranger to come in. So I got a lot of details from her. And then eventually, well, before meeting Denifee, I convinced the roommate to let me come in. She was, and I did that because she would sort of come out and kind of patrol the outside of the apartment to some degree and sort of check me out, because we were just hang out kind of outside the apartment talking to Lillian a lot. And so she was obviously really curious about me and didn't understand who I was. And so I went up and introduced myself and said, hey, you know, this living situation seems like it must be really hard. And I tried to do the thing that like couples therapists do, it's like try to connect with the person really quickly and make them understand that like, okay, I see you, I see your problem. And, you know, I said, well, it must be hard to share such a small space with people you don't know very well and sleep and do all these things. And she like immediately launched into her her complaints. And I said, well, why don't you show me? You know, why don't you show me how bad it is? And so she took me up and like immediately started showing me. And so that's how I was able to see and witness their tension and their relationship, and also just how small this apartment was. And I could see how Denifee spent his time. And then later we managed to get Denifee out to come talk to us. And then what was interesting too there was, like I said, Denifee really came alive in person, but I had been sending him texts and calling, and he wouldn't answer my calls for a long time, and he wouldn't text with me. But eventually I got him to come out by talking on the phone with him, and he came out and he was just incredibly eager to talk. And then later on, when I would try to text him, I didn't get much back. But when I would call him, he was, you know, really just came alive. And I realized later that he wasn't comfortable texting because he was so insecure about his writing ability and using punctuation, which I hadn't realized initially. That it took a while to figure out that that's why he wouldn't answer yes or no questions, but really would not text very much.
Aaliyah.
Hi, Aaliyah USA Today. I'm curious how you think this problem, specifically chronic absenteeism, might play out over the long run. Specifically, you know, you think about how long-term attendance patterns are really influenced by the habits you develop as a young kid. And so if you're a kid who in second grade goes off to Argentina for a month, you might think, you know, later on that's normal, that it's okay to miss school for that long. And to your earlier point about schools really have this messaging problem, you know, I've been to schools that are really firing on all cylinders, trying to get kids to attend school. You know, I followed a school that sent home alarm clocks with the kids. They sent home thermometers so they know how to check their temperature and not just think they're sick when they're not sick. You know, they're doing parent nights. They're you know, coming up with incentives like rewards for like perfect attendance, and none of that's really making a huge dent. It seems, at least in the schools I followed. And so, you know, if these kind of really inconsistent attendance patterns were established at a young age, I can imagine that doesn't bode well for attendance when they're in high school.
I think you're right. And probably even worse if you become behind, right? If you are behind in school and then, you know, have less confidence and don't really want to go. No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's I have not done that much reporting on the solutions, but it is my sense that a lot of them have not panned out. and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of people probably to do it well. And a lot of schools right now don't have a lot of both of those things, right? But I do wonder how much it is, in some places still, I mean, those are some schools. I wonder how, if we really looked at all schools, what percentage of them have taken that type of approach.
Any other questions? Over here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
I'm Corey Mitchell, a reporter with the Center for Public Integrity. I just think that this work was just fascinating. But as a person, I thought that the Atlanta story was appalling. And I do have a technical question about it after saying that. I want to ask about the contact logs and whether the district volunteered to provide those or whether you requested those, because often when a family tells you, okay, this is what happened, you don't get a lot of cooperation from school districts or from social service agencies sort of providing any indication about whether or not the family is, has an accurate description of what happened. So I'm wondering, what happened there? And if the district did provide it, did they see that as, here's the proof that we did something, but, they actually didn't do much more than what they were supposed to do?
It was their idea to give me the contact logs. And what was interesting was that, they just had me sign, they gave me FERPA release forms for the family to sign, and that was, they thought that this, proved that they had done everything they could.
Do you think in part that could be because, one, you were the AP, but two, they are so sort of throwing their hands up about this problem that maybe they were thinking that supporting you in the project could help in some way? Or were they just trying to cover their butts?
No, I just think they had a different sort of sensibility, to be honest, about what, I think that, they had policies during the pandemic that said that, or it seemed like I don't know how official or how ironclad the policy was, but teachers and staff weren't supposed to visit people. They were only supposed to contact people on the phone. I don't know, I haven't canvassed a lot of other districts, but I've certainly run across districts in, Boston, for example, the district that I'm most familiar with. People were going out of their way to get to people's homes, to make contact, to bring them computers, to bring them hotspots, to bring them anything they needed. It was an excuse to try to re-engage someone. People went out of their way to meet people in person. Even though there was this crazy pandemic happening, people, not everyone, but there were certainly people who were on the front line who were doing that type of work, even though there was risk. And that doesn't sound like that was the policy there. To be fair, I should look at the staffing numbers for their social workers and whatnot. I don't know what that is like there. It could be that it's super understaffed. And, but I think that there was but the attitude seemed to be this family really should have, gotten their kids to school.
Ellie Yu at LAist, the NPR station in Atlanta. I have a similar question, and I'm sorry if you already said this. How did you find the LA family? Was it through the school district or another service agency? Yeah, I'm just curious about reporting strategy, what steps you took to find.
Yeah, no, that was a really fascinating story, and I learned a lot of lessons from it. So I was in Atlanta reporting on a different story about reading and about third graders and whether in Atlanta, a high poverty Atlanta public school would be able to get their kids up to reading at third grade level by the end of the year. These kids had been, out of school during the pandemic. And so during that reporting, I spent a lot of time in a low-income housing development and an after-school program there. And I got to know this guy who ran the program, and just casually, I think I was asking him about the impact of the pandemic broadly on the kids he served, and he said there are a lot of kids around this housing development who didn't seem to be in school. And I said, oh, tell me more about that. And he just told me some anecdotes, and then I filed it away. I didn't ask any more about it. I finished the story I was working on, and I sent it to him. And I stayed in touch with him, and I would call him and check in on the kids that I'd written about, that he had a relationship with. And I'd say, how are those kids you told me about who weren't in school? Oh, still not in school. Okay, all right. Called him again, like next month. How are those kids doing? Oh, they're good, this and that. Okay, what about the kids who aren't in school? Well, I don't know, they still aren't in school. I don't know if she's gonna get them in school. Okay, well, do you think she talked to me? Oh, I don't know about that. Okay, well, and then I happened to go to the Education Writers Association meeting, was in Atlanta, so I went and visited him while I was there, and asked him again, what about those kids who aren't in school? Like, what's going on? And then he started to sort of, loosen up about it, and said, and I asked, well, do you think you could ask her, could put me in touch with this mom? And he said, well, let me give her a chance. I want to see if she can resolve this on her own. He thought that he'd helped her to get someone to help her with the enrollments process. Another month went by, it hadn't helped, it hadn't worked out. And so eventually he agreed to give me her number. I called her, she didn't answer. So I asked him, okay, well, when is the next public event you're gonna hold where she might be there? They were doing a backpack giveaway for the beginning of school. And I said, if I show up at this thing, will you introduce me to her? And he said, yes. And so I flew down to Atlanta, and she was the last family to come through the line. And I approached her, or he brought her over to me, so I wouldn't ambush her. And I started, I talked to her, and she seemed pretty open to talking. And I initially, and I asked her mostly just factual questions and details. And then I kind of panicked, and I in doing this work, I've realized I have to really suppress my anxiety around reporting and getting what I need, because it's not pretty. It's not, I become unpleasant. But I panicked, and I said, what does it feel like to not have your kids in school? And she started crying and started heaving. It was not good. And her kids came and she her, and I thought, oh my God, I totally messed this up. She's never gonna talk to me again. And she left, and I said, well, I'm really sorry, obviously, can I call you? And she said yes. And, but I didn't expect her to return my call or take my call, but a week later, she answered the phone, and she called me love, and she talked, and she agreed that I could come down and see her. And so we made an appointment. She wasn't answering the phone a lot, so I told her a date and time, and which was weeks later, and I showed up, and then we kept doing that. And I came down again, and then their phone didn't work anymore. So then I had to keep coming down and I'd send her letters and try to communicate with her through our intermediary.
You have just described what I refer to as the secret sauce in doing this kind of reporting. And for me, it began in '86 when I had to cover a car crash that killed a teenager. And I walk up to this, it's in Clearwater, Florida, and I have to walk up to this front door, and the father flings the door open, and he looks like he's a Marine. He's big and burly. He's got tattoos all over his arms. And I thought he was going to punch me in the face for standing there asking him tell me about your dead son. And when I told him who I was, he said, come in and sit down on the couch. And he pulled out the book, the photo book, and started talking about it, and tears are streaming down his face. And what I realized was, in that moment, he realized this was the last chance to be his son's voice, and to say something good about this boy, and something positive. And so when it comes to stories like these, and I believe you'll agree with me, you're giving voice to people who are enduring unimaginable stress and challenges, who are every minute of every day, it's a hustle. It's how am I going to feed the kids? How am I going to get them to school or find a school? Or how am I going to get a job or whatever? So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're doing this work as well. Covering economic injustice, covering the barriers for children and families can be enormously challenging, and you're talking to vulnerable people. But if you use empathy and if you use respect and so many other tools, what you'll find is that people like this woman will say, well, here's my chance maybe to tell somebody what this is like, and to maybe have somebody else understand what I'm going through and what this is like.
That's right. And I knew from my intermediary that she had this paperwork problem, right? So I was able to sort of say to her, and at this point I had read about the 8 documents that like the district needed, and could tell like this is crazy compared to what most people face. And so I was able to say to her very quickly, this is bananas what you have to do here. I think that there's a really good story here, and I totally understand why this has been difficult. And so I think hearing someone validate what she was going through is what, convinced her to talk to me. It certainly wasn't me saying, how does it feel to have your kids out of school? I mean, it was not a good move.
Bianca, we can keep you here all afternoon, but I'm going to see if there are any final. Oh, hey, last question.
Yeah, Mackenzie Huber with South Dakota Searchlight. So with this, I recently had a story where I was looking at the chronic absentee rate in South Dakota, and of that, so it's grown, obviously, since the pandemic, especially among Native American youth. We're at 54% of Native American children are chronically absent. And the state had a program where they gave out grants for schools to go through this 3-year phase of trying out things. I know you said that you haven't dug into solutions a lot yet, but when I did that story, I called all of the school districts that had been given an award, and the only thing that anyone did was hire absentee advocates or liaisons. That was the only thing anybody was doing for this. Is that really just the main thing going forward? I know she had mentioned that a lot of things haven't been working out. So what does work so far?
I don't know if I'm certainly not an expert on this. I've read everything that Attendance Works has put out, and I am curious about the research behind all of these things, because I don't think there's, rigorous research, like random controlled trials that have gone on for years. I think, unfortunately, this is sort of under, researched in some ways. But yes, I've heard certainly having people tracking the problem seems like a good thing, and people, who form relationships. I mean, the things that I've heard basically essentially come that work essentially is having stronger relationships with kids, right? But that takes, again, a lot of energy and people. But making kids feel seen, understood, and their families, need to feel seen and understood as well, probably, to have, so that they want to send their kids to school and feel like their problems are understood by the school, and not to feel shamed or blamed.
You've summarized it nicely, families being seen and heard. And you've created an incredible body of work that I think will serve as a touchstone for the journalists in this program and across the country once we post your presentation and people get to know who you are. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining the journalists at the Future of the American Child journalism training. So let's show Bianca our appreciation. Thank you so much.